media advertising. It happened for The Guardian, but it didn't happen for us. Whether that's something to do with advertising salespeople, don't get me started, or not, I don't know. But you've got to say it probably wasn't sufficiently well researched.
But it was a good hunch, because this is one of those rare publications where display advertising for recruitment works alongside editorial.
Yes,
when you've got that
sort of, up to a point, and you might have to talk to Mr. Tim Berners-Lee about the impact of the internet.
Well, back in the day, management insisted on about 60% advertising content.
Yeah.
You can see what the media sections have through the years.
Yeah.
That was the great disappointment of the section.
And we knew working on it then it was disappointing.
Yeah.
We understood that.
Just try one more question, Penny. I guess what I take from your paper, which I think is really fascinating, like it's a really different kind of history of the Australian, it's really fascinating, is what you're raising is the difficulty of getting journalism on journalism, or getting a sort of a healthy debate about journalism from the inside. And I just, I think you've done a great case study in this instance. I just wonder if you have a broader kind of comment on why is it so hard in the Australian news field to get a constructive and productive kind of debate about journalism in journalism?
It's a great question. I think what this demonstrated early on was the Australian was in one sense a little bit late to the piece. It had followed Media Watch and it had followed the Media Report, and Fairfax had dedicated reporters. And this showed a real seriousness, and in many ways it did it better initially than any of the others, because it was this community of interest that I've described. I think there are the perennial arguments about this. We're a small market. There are the constant criticisms about being inwardly looking, and that, as a media reporter and as a career media reporter, you're always conscious of this fact that you are inwardly reporting what you're doing in a relatively small community. And I think we constantly underestimate the appetite for this, because Australian audiences have grown over the years to want and have a great appetite for understanding how our media works. But whether we reached a point, I don't know, sometime after Frontline, where we all felt we were media savvy all of a sudden and we didn't need it to quite the same degree, I don't know. But I think the need now is just as great as it's ever been.
Excellent place to end. Thank you.
Discussion, debate, democracy. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Mark Day. Mark has been a journalist for 54 years, during which time he has been a copy boy, cadet, reporter, editor, publisher, columnist, proprietor of newspapers, magazines and radio stations. He's been a radio and television current affairs host, an author and a blogger. He is a former publisher and editor-in-chief of The Australian and has contributed a column to its media section since its beginning in 1999. Mark is going to be talking to us today about the proprietorial model.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you to Professor Murray-Goot and Bridget. Thank you very much for the invitation. In the manner of housekeeping, I must follow Sally Young yesterday with a disclaimer or two. I'm a freelance journalist. I was employed by News Corp until, well, from 1960 to 1978, but I left the company as publisher of The Australian, or later editor-in-chief of The Australian. I spent 20 years away, but I've been on the contributors list since the establishment of the media section in 1999. But I am still a freelancer, and the following views are mine and not those of News Corp. Just thought you'd want to know that. Now, I prepared this talk before yesterday, and necessarily some areas I cover will be a repeat of some of the elements we talked about yesterday. But today I want to put the case for the proprietorial model of newspaper publishing, and I have a very simple starting proposition, and that is that without Rupert Murdoch as an old-fashioned proprietor, you wouldn't have had the Australian 50 years ago, you wouldn't have the Australian today, and as a consequence, you wouldn't be here today. It's fashionable around the world to speak ill of Rupert Murdoch, but I want to defend him, warts and all, because without his vision, his enterprise, his tenacity, and at times his pure cussedness, Australia would not have had the forum that the Australian has provided for us to debate ourselves, to debate our directions, to debate our legal, moral and commercial frameworks, all of which for the past 50 years have helped shape what we are today. And it's precisely the individual idiosyncrasies, the bees in his bonnet, the shifts, the somersaults, the backflips, the big calls, the wrong calls, the missteps, and, yes, his triumphs, that we have in Murdoch's life and career. They have brought meaning to the Australian, and through that have influenced our lives. Rupert Murdoch has shown himself to be a great risk-taker. Not only has he bet his company on several occasions and won those bets, but every day he encourages risk amongst his editors and his journalists. Risk-taking is part of his DNA, and it flows through the company in many ways, which I'll explain shortly. It's the kind of risk that publishing companies without strong individual proprietors are largely unwilling to take. I don't intend to make this address part of a pot-stirring argy-bargy between News Corp and Fairfax, but if you look at the relative positions of the two companies, one with a strong proprietor, the other without, at the very least I think it makes a case for strong leadership. Rupert didn't invent the role of media mogul. There were earlier models. In the first half of the 20th century, controversy raged in America over the influence, for good or evil, of William Randolph Hearst. He owned a chain of newspapers across the nation and used them to pursue his political ambitions, unsuccessfully, as it turned out. But Hearst's papers were accused of inventing the sensational and often salacious formats that became known as the yellow press. It's a derogatory term that may have described their predilection for news from the courts and the underbelly of national life, but it doesn't describe their popularity. Hearst instinctively knew what people wanted, and as a publisher he found no fault in giving them what they wanted. Neither has Rupert. In the UK, the Canadian Max Aitken became Lord Beaverbrook. He was also a single-minded press baron with extraordinary management skills. He's remembered today for the Daily Express newspaper, which was propagandist for the British Empire, and during the 30s was the largest selling English-language newspaper in the world with a circulation of more than 3 million. But Beaverbrook was more than just a press baron. He was also a politician. He presided over the manufacture of aircraft for the British war effort and was credited with winning the war of machines. He was a fully fledged political player in Britain, often wrong, but never in doubt, just like Rupert. Rupert Murdoch was a boy and a teenager in the era of Hearst and Beaverbrook, and these examples of press power and influence cannot have escaped him. If they did, he saw it on a smaller scale, not so much close to home, but at home, because his boyhood was built around accompanying his father, Sir Keith, as he built the Herald and Weekly Times group into a dominant force in Australian publishing. He's told stories of sitting at his father's feet while the old man negotiated this deal or that. So how it could not occur to him that he had ahead of him a lifetime of opportunity and the opportunity to exercise great influence is quite beyond me. Certainly he absorbed many of his father's thoughts, and only recently have we learned that the idea for the Australian was not Rupert's but his father's. He explained to Paul Kelly in May that the idea of a national newspaper able to explore the issues that united the nation was his father's dream. It was an impossible dream for the old man because the technologies did not exist to allow daily distribution nationally, and even if they had, the preoccupation with war and post-war recovery would have precluded it. And even when Rupert decided that the time had come for a national paper, he was somewhat reckless. He would never have said it at the time, but I believe the Australian was founded more on a dream and hope than a proper analysis and assessment of prevailing markets. It was a leap of faith, as Max Newton said, a wild idea, a preposterous concept in so many ways that any self-respecting board would have kiboshed it before it began. Only a headstrong young proprietor with his own skin in the game would have been reckless enough or rash enough to say, go. We heard yesterday of the early days of market research and polling, but back there was none. It was more of a gut feeling than anything else. I mean, Terry Bede yesterday told us how Rupert and he used to go sailing on the harbour. I recall one Christmas party we were sailing on the harbour, and we booked the barbecues on Goat Island to have a barbecue after the sail. This was for the Daily Mirror. And when we got onto Goat Island, we found that there was another party already using the barbecue, an extended family of Greeks from Liverpool. And rather than have a fight over who owned the barbecue, the parties merged. And as the wine and the red cedar went down, and the dolmades got exchanged for chops and all that sort of thing, we had a wonderful time on Goat Island. And for 2 weeks after that, Rupert was going around thumping the table with all his editors about looking after stories from the West. He said, I talk to people from the West all the time. But that was the nature of his market research. It was more who you bumped into than any formal research of the kind that Terry and Sol Leibovitz have taken on in the years since. In 1964, newspaper publishing was a very cumbersome and costly process compared with today. These days, reporters take their phones or tablets or laptop into the field, and their stories are captured on the first keystroke. But in the early 60s, as a copy boy, I used to go with reporters to events like big sporting occasions. The reporter would type his copy on a portable typewriter. I would then read that copy to a copy taker in the office, who would take it all down with a second set of keystrokes. The story would then be subbed and then go to a linotype operator, who would apply a third set of keystrokes. Eventually, it would appear in print, having gone through compositors, the stereotype machines and the press group. Today, those first keystrokes are manipulated on screen and produced as printing plates, sometimes thousands of kilometres from where they were generated. In 1964, Rupert was convinced that he could cobble together a national distribution system for one reason, and that is that Max Newton was already doing it on the Fin Review. Very much smaller scale and a bit slow. Rupert thought he could improve on it, but it was being done, and that was one of the catalysts for Rupert to say, now is the time to go. Rupert reasoned that if Fairfax could do it, he could do it, so he hired Max to do it for him, and then put his plan to the board. Now, there was immediate pushback from the old guard directors, who they regarded their job as keeping a steadying or restraining hand on the impulsive young man's shoulders. But they were pillars of the Adelaide establishment, Sir Stanley Murray and Sir Ewan Waterman and Sir Edgar Bean, and their byword was prudence. They didn't buy Rupert's boyish adventurism. Their job was to contain his intemperance, but Rupert pushed back hard and won guarded approval. On the condition, he was given the go-ahead by his board on the condition that this project didn't put the whole company into loss. Well, it very nearly did that. The News Limited profits in the year of the launch were $1.4 million on a turnover of $21 million. I don't know what that's worth these days, inflation accounted, but they weren't huge numbers even back then. Profit of $1.4 million on a turnover of $21 million. In its first year, the Australian lost $1.4 million. But it generated an extra $15 million of turnover for the group. And I have calculated for the 50 years in 50 days series that if you inflation adjust all the Australian losses for the first 20 years, they would amount to more than $250 million. But in the profitable years between 1985 and 2007, the contribution to the company was in the order of $300 million. How you inflation account the whole thing would be very, very difficult, because I don't believe actual figures for actual years exist, and we did some averaging. But if you look at the entire life of the Australian from Rupert's point of view, you would probably say it's washed its face. The post-GFC years, coupled with the double whammy of the online digital revolution, have led to renewed losses. But, as I say, overall the entire exercise has, for all intents and purposes, broken even in dollars. Now, in influence, you'd have to do a whole different set of calculations. But if we can go back to the start. Rupert's project was conceived and developed in total secrecy, but typically it was Rupert who let the cat out of the bag. He decided with Max Newton that the new paper had to be based in Canberra, the nation's capital. It would report Canberra to the nation and the nation to Canberra. Its primary market would be Canberra, and the national distribution was almost an afterthought, something to be developed in time. But we heard yesterday from Pat Clarks, who told how Rupert joked that he'd run the Canberra Times out of business, only to be gazumped by the wily old Rupert Henderson, who took over and bulked up the Times. That stymied Rupert's plans to use Canberra as the financial backbone of the growth into a national newspaper. By the time Rupert's teams began canvassing the suburbs of Canberra for potential subscribers, they found the Times was too deeply entrenched, and they recognised to succeed the Australian would need a bigger market than Canberra could provide, both for circulation sales and for advertising revenue. And an all-night planning session took place in Melbourne in March 1964, and this was the whole project rested on this one meeting. It was in the Southern Cross Hotel in Melbourne. Rupert was there with the senior executives from all his interstate companies, plus Newton and a couple of others, and they all night worked on how we would do it, how we could do it, what were the possibilities, and they came up with a plan to make up the paper in Canberra, to fly the mats, which are cardboard impressions of the made-up pages, to Sydney and Melbourne for printing. Brisbane and Adelaide would be supplied by air later in the day. It was cumbersome, and it was a great leap in faith that all the elements that could go wrong would not go wrong. And of course they frequently did go wrong, especially in the winter when fogs shut the Canberra airport regularly, provoking the need for the madcap and dangerous drives rushing the mats to Sydney along the goat track that was the Hume Highway in those days. Or Tacoma Airport, which was traditionally above the fog line. It was a clunky system, and the amazing thing is that it was tried at all. I might just provide here, as an aside, a glimpse of the way we were in those days. I mentioned selling subscriptions. In those days, selling subscriptions, or selling anything really, televisions, encyclopedias, insurance, all involved door-to-door salesmen. They were as ubiquitous then as dinner-time phone calls from Bombay were before the do-not-call register was invented. Knocking on doors, hard-selling householders on the merits of their products, whatever it may be. Not everyone was very good at it. Rupert brought a team of young workers from Sydney to help out under the watchful eye of the Australian's administrative manager, Don Davies, who tells us his job was to look after the cars and the accommodation and the likes for all those early recruits in Canberra. But Rupert, of course, told him to watch out for costs. So Don looked at the results of the door knockers and decided a couple of the young females from Sydney weren't pulling their weight, and he recommended that they should be sent home. But Rupert overruled him, and so it was that Miss Anna Torv, door knocker, continued door knocking for a while before becoming the new Mrs. Murdoch and mother of Elizabeth, Lachlan and James. The minutiae of history, eh? But anyway, the launch of the Australian was set for September. Remember, this is March 64. September was the launch. But the costs mounted, and one day early in 1964, early in July 64, Rupert marched through the newsroom clutching a bill for 7,000 quid, a telephone bill for 7,000 quid, and he declared, "I can't take this any longer. I'm desperate, must have some revenue, must have some cash flow." So the launch, he decided, would be brought forward, and after just one full dummy run, the Australian would be born on July 15, a Wednesday. Now, can you imagine a board of crusty old Conservative directors doing that? They wouldn't have had the wit, the balls, or the capacity to do it. Only a headstrong proprietor, helped along by the likes of an equally headstrong Max Newton, with all his enthusiasm and willingness to give it a go. Only somebody like Rupert could have called that shot and had the audacity to carry it through. Rupert had to fight his own directors, and as the months passed and as the initial curiosity waned, the costs rose and the losses mounted, and he had to continually ignore advice to give it all away. His most senior editors, his closest friends and advisors on papers like The News in Adelaide, begged him to stop the losses. There was resentment throughout the company that built on a belief that Rupert was throwing away the fruits of all their hard labours on this crazy project. And Rupert knew that he had jumped prematurely into the space that he'd always dreamed might one day be available, a national newspaper, but he was determined not to let anybody have that space, and he hung on. The fact that the Australian was launched, the fact is the Australian was launched at the wrong time and in the wrong city. 2 years later, the distribution problems were largely overcome by the introduction of facsimile systems and the move to Sydney. Fax technology had been around since the 20s and was used extensively by the press to distribute wire photos, but it was never good enough to faithfully reproduce the small type required for a newspaper. The problem was overcome by the British Muirhead Company when it developed a square light reader to replace the traditional round light reader, thus eliminating distortion. Whoever would have understood that? But it was the one technological breakthrough that made it possible to print 4 3/4 point by facsimile. Fax technology was hideously expensive. I think it cost something like $600,000 to buy those facsimile units back then. So what on earth that would be worth today, I don't know. It was hideously expensive to buy, but it did deliver certainty for production schedules. It wasn't all plain sailing. Costs still far outweighed revenues, and there was no end in sight for the bleeding. Circulations hovered around the 60,000 day level, sometimes as low as 50, far below the theoretical break-even of 80,000. But even when Adrian Deemer was able to get sales above 100,000, the costs of getting them there still left a big red hole in the P&L accounts. I have no doubt, but for one thing, the Australian would have died in the early 70s. It was sucking the lifeblood out of News Limited's finances, and not only had the board worried, it had Rupert's bankers worried as well. What saved the Australian, in my view, was Rupert's audacious takeover of the News of the World in London. He saw an opportunity and he grabbed it. He convinced the Carr family, which held the majority shareholding in the old muckraker with its predilection for stories about Vickers in fishnet stockings, and because of its predilection for Vickers and fishnets, it had a sale of $7 million a week. Anyway, Rupert convinced the Carrs that he was a better ownership prospect than that terrible old bouncing cheque, Robert Maxwell, and the Carrs got a stake in News Limited. One of them came to Australia to look at all his properties and was taken around the empire by senior staff members who found themselves in Alice Springs, and the building in which the Central Australian Advocate, which sold about 2,500 copies a week, was housed was an old tin shed on the outer skirts of town, not very imposing at all. So as the executives took Sir William Carr on a drive down the main street of Alice Springs, saying, we can't go to the factory today because there's industrial problems, sorry about that, but it's over there, he said, pointing at the town hall or the post office. And he was suitably impressed with this imposing building. Yes, right, now we'll go on to Darwin and have our great tour of what I own in Australia, he thought. Anyway. Yes, the Carr's got a stake in News Limited, and Rupert invaded Fleet Street, very quickly adding the Sun, so his presses, which were idle 6 days a week, would have a 7-day operation. And the Sun converted from a boring, unloved union broadsheet into a rambunctious, cheeky tabloid, and sales went through the roof, and soon News International was throwing off millions of dollars a week, enough to support not only the Australian, but also in due course the Times as well. And those operations bankrolled Rupert's great worldwide expansion into film, television, both free-to-air and subscription services, satellites, cable news, books, inserts, online digital services, the whole box and dice. But without that moment where he was able to get those profits to first support the Australian, I believe he would have had to capitulate in due course. Now, the story of Murdoch's growth into a global mogul is well known. He established himself internationally and, I believe, became the most successful businessman Australia has ever produced. It's my contention that the amazing rise of News Corp happened only because of the drive, the audacity, the cunning, the risk-taking and the skill of its proprietor. Can you imagine any board preoccupied with weighing risk and protecting shareholders' funds going for the things Rupert went for? Can you imagine the risk-averse Fred Hilmer ratcheting up the borrowings, betting the company on start-ups like the Australian or B-Sky B in the UK or Fox News in the US? Could you imagine Roger Corbett doing it at Fairfax? I don't think so. It was Rupert who drove his boards and created the culture of competition and winning that led to his greatest triumphs and his greatest failures. I accept that I might be making it sound as if Rupert did all this himself. Not by any means. He hired smart people in the hope that they would share his vision, but not all of them were resounding successes. Max Newton was a flamboyant and, it turned out, a deeply flawed individual whose brilliance was central to the early days of the Oz. But in those days, Max was a warrior for free markets, and Rupert, now a warrior for free markets, was in the thrall of Deputy Prime Minister John McEwen, who was the high priest of protectionism. And the fact that the proprietor and the editor had diametrically opposing views meant it was inevitable there would be tears. And Rupert had already learned the hard way that there could only be one boss. In 1960, he sacked his friend and mentor, Rowan Rivett, as editor of the News, because Rivett wanted to go one way, and Rupert didn't want to go there. So there could only be one boss. Newton, at the Australian, left after a year, and Walter Commer came in to bring stability, but without Newton's vigour and verve. Adrian Deemer unleashed new talents and new writers and new thinkers through his beautifully crafted pages. But while Rupert had originally positioned the Australian as a small L liberal publication, he was changing his thinking in Britain, beset by union problems, which he later fixed at Wapping, which no board would have approved. And he was also growing, he was worried about union problems, and he was growing in support of free market policies. So he thought Adrian Deemer's small L liberal Australian wasn't being tough enough in its calls for economic and workplace reforms. So Deemer, in his memoir, says Rupert told him he wasn't producing the kind of paper he wanted, and Deemer